private equity funding remains a viable alternative for budding businesses in light of the excessive and sometimes cutthroat cost of funding offered by commercial banks. Now, while efforts put in place by the government to boost investor confidence and support local businesses is recognized, a lot is still required for improvement to the business climate. Joining us now via Skype to tell us more about the market is the Senior Vice President of Investment at Synergy Capital, Segun Onokomaya. Good evening, Mr. Onokomaya. Thanks for joining us on the program.
Thank you, Edidion. Good evening. It's good to be on.
Well, a survey carried out by the African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association indicates that private equity and venture capital activity in Africa has been increasingly consistent over the years, with West Africa and Nigeria in particular selected as the most attractive destinations. Now, what could be the reason for this?
Thank you, Edidion. I think basically the number of factors that has made Nigeria and perhaps West Africa the destination of choice for a lot of private equity investors. I think first and foremost, if you think about it, Nigeria is certainly the largest economy in Africa. And across the board, across a variety of indicators, you see that Nigeria is by far the destination of choice. First off, if you think about it, our population, the largest in Africa, certainly at around 200 million. In terms of demographics, we have a young and growing population that consumes a lot of services, anything from from foods and drinks, mobile phones. They watch television a lot. They travel. So across the board, if you think about that, for private equity to to be attracted to a destination, there has to be a host of factors that make that destination attractive. And Nigeria, I think, across all indices, is one by far has garnered the most attention.
So, what's the current level of private equity in Nigeria?
So if you think about it, I think the study that you probably referenced from AVCA looked at data from 2013 to about 2018, and across the number of deals, both by the number of transactions and by value, which essentially speaks to the quantum of deals. Nigeria has by far been tops. I think the data that we're looking at for those years. The number of transactions is probably just shy of 300, and Nigeria had about 54% or thereabouts of that number. And by value, I think over those 5 or 6 years, there's been upwards of almost $11 billion in transactions that came into West Africa, and Nigeria attracted about 70 to 75% of that number.
Okay, so can you fill us in on the current major trends in private equity right now?
Oh, wow. Well, I think in terms of trends, what's probably most at the top of most investors or the trend landscape is probably fintech. Most of your viewers might, who have mobile telephones. I think major participants in that. So fintech again, I think has garnered a lot of attention. But I think activity has been consistent and increasing across the variety of sectors. Logistics is one. Consumer goods has attracted, I think, a lot of attention. You think about the variables that I spoke to earlier around just our demographics and the population, urbanization as well, has made consumer goods, the consumer sector, I think, a destination sector of choice. Healthcare and pharmaceuticals is another one. And you see increasingly private equity investors looking at investments in hospitals and retail pharmacies. In Nigeria, the insurance sector, another sector of interest. I think the ongoing recapitalization exercise in that space has attracted or is attracting a lot of investor interest. And I think we continue to see trends, I think, largely shaped by technology across sectors from agriculture, to consumer services. a lot of company entrepreneurs are looking at technology as an enabler to improve efficiencies how they conduct their business. So we continue to see those trends, for over the short to.
Okay, so 2 weeks ago, the CBN and FMDQ introduced long-term Naira-settled OTC FX futures contract. Now, what are the implications of these, long-term contracts on private equity players who manage dollar funds in local currencies?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think one of the things that's foremost on the minds of investors when it comes to bringing in capital into a country is essentially the stability of the foreign exchange regime. Investors want to have the freedom and latitude to be able to bring in capital and also know that when it's time to repatriate that capital, there is some stability. The funds has maintained its value. That I think the current regime for the last update from FMC and CBN was sort of a 12-month contract. While that was able to provide some stability, a lot of investors shied away from bringing or increasing the capital inflow to the country because typically when investors bring capital, they want to look at a short to medium term horizon, which is 3 to 5 years. And to the extent that you can have certainty around uh, your exchange rate when you need to exit or take out your capital, that provides I think the stability to the market. So that's on the price side. So that's talking about the risk of price. I think the other element which perhaps was not addressed by FMDQ and CBN is liquidity. So it's one thing for you to bring in your capital and know that you have a stable exchange and you need to take it out. In terms of the availability of that exchange, it's time to repatriate is another question in time was not dealt with. But that being said, we still think it's good progress going forward for the sector.
So, are there current challenges of scarcity of foreign exchange in the market or an illiquid interbank market impacting on Nigeria's attractiveness or as a destination for private equity?
It's not I wouldn't say there's scarcity of FX. I think in Nigeria, what you see certainly is that with the 12-month OTC contracts and the new contract that CBN and FMDQ just introduced, we think that provides some level of assurance to investors. So I wouldn't say there is liquidity in the market. What's happening, which I think affects investors and entrepreneurs all over, is certainly the availability of effects. I think Nigeria likely remains an import-dependent economy, and to the extent that a lot of inputs going to certainly manufacturing processes are imported, there is going to be challenges, going forward. So I think the way you look at it is for investors such as us. What we look at is to the extent that you can find businesses that source their inputs locally, then you essentially sort of mitigate that foreign exchange risk.
What recent reforms or proposals for reform affect private equity in Nigeria?
Well, I think one certainly in terms of reform is what we talked about, just in terms of the FX regime and taking out or reducing the FX price risk for investors when they need to repatriate their capital. The other things that you see that we think would encourage or proposals we think that are positive for the sector would be just things around infrastructure and ease of doing business. I think one of the challenges with Nigeria is that the policy inaction or ineffectiveness has, I think, has a direct impact on the ability of investors to want to commit capital to the country. So to the extent that the government can make substantive reforms around improving the educational sector, including the power sector, uh, addressing issues around importers being able to get goods out of port in a timely fashion. We think those are all reforms and developments that would do well for attracting increasing private capital into Nigeria.
Are there tax incentives or other schemes to encourage investment in portfolio companies?
So I think with respect to investment in portfolio companies, I think the government, is the Nigerian government. I think the last I remember is around putting in tax waivers or pioneer status regime to encourage growth in certain sectors. Perhaps the last I remember is perhaps in 2017, where specific sectors were targeted to have a 3 to 5 year tax waivers. I think some of those sectors I think include agriculture. There are some incentives for manufacturing as well. But I think largely for us as investors, we try to focus on what sort of that micro element of a company is. How does a company succeed and thrive, irrespective of what government efforts or tax incentives are, because essentially you want a company that can grow over the long term on its own merits, by essentially just improving on its own proposition in the marketplace. So tax incentives are in place, targeted at some sectors, but we largely look for companies that can continue to make progress in their businesses, irrespective of what the tax regime is.
Okay, so just before I let you go, what's the outlook this year for private equity investment at Synergy Capital?
Well, I think in general we continue to be excited about the prospect in Nigeria.
Let's
One of the things that we look at again is to look at companies that are essentially investment ready. What I mean by that is, while there's a wide universe of companies that we can invest in, the readiness of a company or an industry to accept our investment is a critical factor, and that means everything from having their tax their tax status in place, having the right management in place who's committed and focused. And I think if some of those things are in place, we continue to be excited about various sectors, including the fintech financial services sector. Agro services is another sector that we're excited about. We also see a lot of upside as investors and sponsors continue to make inroads into sectors like healthcare, and agriculture, amongst others.
Thank you so much for coming on the program, Mr. Shegun Onokomaya.